Hello friends, welcome to our channel History Chronicles. In the late 18th century, France was a nation on the brink of revolution, and at the heart of the unrest was one of the most basic human needs, bread. For centuries, bread had been the staple of the French diet, especially for the working poor. Yet, as the 1780s wore on, the price of this essential food began to soar, leading to widespread discontent that would contribute to the revolutionary fervor sweeping the nation. The French economy was in dire straits, burdened by debt from costly wars and an inefficient tax system that placed a heavy burden on the common people. Compounding these issues was a series of poor harvests, which led to grain shortages and drove up the price of bread to unprecedented levels. In Paris and other urban centers, where the majority of the population relied on bread as their primary source of sustenance, this was nothing short of a crisis. By 1788 and 1789, bread prices had reached such heights that many could no longer afford to feed their families. The situation was exacerbated by rumors that grain was being hoarded by speculators and that the government was indifferent to the plight of the poor. For the people of France, this was not just an economic problem. It was a matter of survival. The anger and frustration of the people soon boiled over into action. Bread riots began to erupt across the country, with hungry crowds storming bakeries, markets, and granaries in search of food. In some cases, the rioters would seize grain shipments or force bakers to sell their bread at what they deemed a just price. These riots were often spontaneous and driven by the desperation of those involved. But they also reflected a deep-seated belief that the government and the wealthy were failing in their moral duty to ensure that everyone had enough to eat. In Paris, the bread riots took on a particularly intense character. The capital was home to a large and restive population, many of whom were unemployed or underemployed. As bread prices continued to rise, the city's markets became flashpoints for unrest. Women, who were often the ones responsible for buying food for their families, played a prominent role in these riots. They would lead the charge to bakeries and marketplaces, demanding that bakers lower their prices or that officials release hoarded grain. The bread riots were not just about food. They were also about power and justice. The people of France, especially the poor, saw the price of bread as a symbol of the broader inequities in their society. They believed that the aristocracy and the government were more concerned with their own wealth and privileges than with the welfare of the people. By taking to the streets and demanding bread at a fair price, the rioters were also demanding a more just and equitable society. One of the most significant bread riots occurred in the spring of 1789, just months before the fall of the Bastille. In April, a rumor spread through Paris that a wealthy factory owner, Varennes, had suggested lowering wages to offset the high cost of bread. Enraged by this perceived insult, a mob descended on Varennes' home and factory, looting and destroying property in a violent outburst that left several people dead. This riot, known as the Varennes Riots, was one of the first major episodes of violence in the revolutionary period and served as a precursor to the more widespread unrest that would soon engulf the country. As the bread riots continued to spread, they began to take on a more organized and political character. The people of France were no longer just demanding bread. They were demanding change. The grievances that had been simmering for years over taxes, feudal obligations, and the concentration of power in the hands of the few were now being voiced in the streets. The bread riots were a clear sign that the social contract between the rulers and the ruled had broken down, and that the people were ready to take matters into their own hands. The bread riots of 1789 were a critical moment in the lead-up to the French Revolution. They highlighted the desperation and anger of the French people, and they showed the ruling elite that the status quo could no longer be maintained. While these riots were often chaotic and violent, they were also deeply symbolic. They were a manifestation of the people's demand for justice, for fairness, and for the basic necessities of life. As the revolution progressed, the issue of bread would remain a central concern. Even as the National Assembly debated the future of the nation, the people in the streets were still struggling to put food on the table. The cry for bread, liberty, and equality became a rallying point for revolutionaries, And it was a reminder that the revolution was not just about political change, but about ensuring that every citizen had the means to live with dignity. Thank you for joining us today on History Chronicles. The bread riots were more than just a reaction to hunger. They were a powerful expression of the people's demand for a better life. As we continue to explore the events of the French Revolution, we'll see how this demand would shape the course of history and lead to the radical changes that transformed France. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring with History Chronicles.